is Joe Chuman.
That's right. And don't you forget.
The witty Dr. Chuman has been leader of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County, New Jersey since 1974, and since 2008 has served as a part-time leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture, and we're lucky to have him. As an activist, Dr. Chuman has worked on behalf of human rights, civil liberties, and in opposition to the death penalty, as well as many other progressive causes. He founded the Northern New Jersey group of Amnesty International in 1974, and currently serves as president of the Bergen County Sanctuary for Asylum Seekers, founded by the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County. This coalition of religious and human rights organizations provides services for asylum seekers who are released from federal detention. Dr. Chuman teaches human rights at the graduate level at Columbia University and is taught at the United Nations University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica. He has published numerous articles in the Record of Bergen County, New Jersey. He has also had articles published in the New York Times, the Humanist, Free Inquiry, Humanistic Judaism, and other periodicals. He's had articles published on ethical culture and religion in several encyclopedias. Please welcome Dr. Joe Chuman.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here on this beautiful summer day. Nice to be back. Before I give my talk, I want to say something. That's a joke. You know, some of you may know that I had some knee surgery in July, and it's my 6th orthopedic surgery. I'm very healthy. I have never missed a platform address ever in my 50 years of giving platform addresses. Illness has never kept me away. I don't get sick very often, but I'm an orthopedic wreck. And right, I had a knee replacement surgery, and I got to tell you, before you have your knee replaced, see me, talk to me first. Right? To use a bad metaphor, hip replacement is a cakewalk compared to this, but I've been suffering from, without going into grisly details, from the after effects, still do, I'm not out of the woods, from the after effects of the medications that I took, which I stopped taking a month ago, but the after effects are still with me, even though I took them very modestly, fearing that I would have repercussions, which I have. It's been absolutely awful. But that's not my point. My point is that I did receive some very, very lovely cards from members of the Ethical Society and some phone calls. And I'm very touched and I'm very moved, and I think it speaks very highly of our community here. You know, as humanists, when we think of our humanism, we probably more readily point to the great social justice achievements of the New York Society, of which we're very proud, as we should be. But in my view, humanism, more importantly, exists in the smaller, quieter, interpersonal circles of life, in the kindness that we bestow on others, in the sharing, in the caring, and in the mutual support. I think that's where our humanism, more importantly, lies, to be honest with you. And so many of you have been so forthcoming in your kindness and giving, and I think, again, not only am I personally very grateful, but I think it speaks very well of our community, and I do want to thank you very much for the kindness that you've extended, okay? Those are my opening words. Right? Well, you might think from my title that this could be a very morbid talk, but really my topic, my theme is exactly the opposite. I want to talk about the interesting human preoccupation with trying to find what we might call ecstatic experiences that launch us beyond, indeed, the mundane pain and suffering that we suffer, all of us suffer in life and so forth, and how human beings have striven since the beginning of time to really, in some sense, alter their consciousness in order to escape this world, and to ask where ethical culture stands in that interesting human journey. So that's what my talk essentially is about. When it comes time for me to deliver a platform address these days, I do find myself at first drawn into the vortex of our current political universe. Our political reality is like a black hole that pulls at us, unnerves us, and at this stage, given the craziness emanating from the White House, we are simply wearied by it. But that is not all. Between devastating fires in the Amazon, Siberia, and Africa, with the Arctic melting at an unprecedented rate, with the oceans, which we think of as pristine and inexhaustible, suffused with garbage and plastic that will be around forever, it feels as if the environmental apocalypse is simply pressing in on us. The bad news at times overwhelms, and I entertain the compulsion to retreat or otherwise escape. So there come times when I feel the need to flee the grasp of the vortex, in great measure simply to maintain my sanity and to try to reestablish some emotional equilibrium, and this morning I declare is such a time. I deliberately will not address our current world situation, but rather turn to a topic that is as remote as can be from the events of the moment. I usually reserve my inaugural address of each new season to an exploration of the nature of ethical culture and its humanistic philosophy, and so I will this morning. Each such endeavor has me searching for some way to interpret our guiding ideas in new and fresh ways, which is the task I've set for myself today. So let me begin. As an atheist, I have long been fascinated by religion. I'm one of those atheists who's fascinated by religion. In fact, I have 3 graduate degrees in religion, okay? So I'm really interested in religion, not so much in terms of specific religious doctrines, but in what I believe are the deeper questions about reality and our relations to it that religion in its philosophical role and in its best sense, I think, engages. I often like to say that I generally don't agree with the answers that religion comes up with, but I do often find the questions the religions pose fascinating and very important because they often relate very directly to the search for meaning in life, which is a search I believe most thoughtful people such as ourselves are fated to engage. There are an endless number of perspectives and issues I could investigate this morning, but let me focus on just one. It seems to me that the great religions, despite their tremendous diversity, are all based on the assumption that the human condition is in some sense problematic, that the human condition is problematic. In other words, that we are as human creatures not quite fitted for the reality into which we have been thrust. We are like an ill-shaped piece of a jigsaw puzzle, which given our needs, drives, and limitations are ill-matched for the environment in which we find ourselves. Hence, given our limitations and imperfections, human beings are inherently ill at ease with the world. In short, life and our condition confront us with problems. While this presumption is central to religion, there's really nothing quite so radical about it. The curiosity that drives much of secular philosophy derives from the same assumption. Indeed, the very desire to know, to gain a better understanding of the world, is often based on the yen to overcome ignorance, and through knowledge gain clarity, strength, power, peace of mind, and mastery over our condition that we would otherwise not have. We are ill at ease, and we want to find a better way. We want to be comfortable in our own skin and in our world. For example, when I talk about secular philosophers, the preeminent humanist thinker John Dewey was very much a secularist, and he based much of his thought on the bedrock assumption that for human beings, indeed for all organic life, that life is inherently problematic. We are faced with problems at every turn, every turn. As we confront problems, we engage our intelligence, our critical reasoning, and our best evidence in order to overcome our problems, whether deciding what we're going to wear today or working to cure cancer. Once we resolve our problem, we momentarily are at rest. We achieve satisfaction until soon again we confront new problems and apply the same processes of reason and experiment in order to overcome them. And so on and on it goes in what Dewey believed is an incremental rising spiral of progress. Slow, but we're getting there for our species as a whole. Life in general is a never-ending process of problem solving in order to reach positions of greater fulfillment, peace, and satisfaction. But the religions generally take a more radical view and make escaping the problematic nature of the human condition, as mentioned, central to them. So in Christianity, the central presumption about people is that the human being is born alienated from God, his creator, which ensures that ours is a condition of sin. From this, a lot of bad things happen. Not only is the human being spiritually unfulfilled, most likely morally adrift, but also suffers most of all from the foreboding and the reality of death. Such is the human predicament writ large. The cure is to get right with God, accept the dominion, love, and grace of Jesus as one's Savior, and the person who so believes and dedicates his life will overcome sin, will live in a state of blessedness and grace, and achieve, at long last, eternal life. Life will overcome death. It may come as a surprise, and perhaps a very uncomfortable one for us, that ethical culture in the mind of its founder, Felix Adler, was built on a parallel framework, namely that the human condition is fundamentally problematic and a way needs to be found to get out of it. Here I need to be very precise. When asked whether ethical culture was Felix Adler's religion, he said no. My religion is not ethical culture. My religion is what Adler called, quote, ethical religion. In other words, he differentiated between ethical culture and ethical religion. What was the difference in his mind? Well, ethical culture is a much broader concept. It is a movement open to all people, provided they proclaim the primacy, the central importance of ethics in their lives. How they justify that commitment to the primacy of ethics is personal and individual to them. Some come to their ethics through a secular philosophy, some through a belief in some kind of spiritual order. For others, it's a matter of intuition, and many others, who aren't particularly reflective, through no particular foundation at all. Yet, Felix Adler had his own very personal, sophisticated, and difficult philosophical view about how reality is structured, and that understanding provided the framework for what he termed ethical religion, his religion. Without getting into too many details, this will be head-spinning, one aspect of his religious viewpoint is that the human condition is set up in such a way that we are constantly open to a life filled with frustration. For the Christian, sin may be the bedrock problem. For Felix Adler, frustration is inherent in the human condition. How so? In Adler's view, reality is in a sense twofold. On the one hand, we live in the actual world that we experience every day, a world in which we are continually subject to the slings and arrows of misfortune. We suffer pain and illness, loss, sorrow, tragedy, and death, as well as, of course, happiness and joy. We are, as most everyone will conclude, religious and otherwise, vulnerable creatures. We are vulnerable creatures. Such is our everyday condition. But on the other hand, Adler maintained that there is, above or within, this, what he called the actual world of everyday experience, Adler maintained that there is an ideal realm that we can frame with our minds. If we suffer from pain, illness, poverty, loss, and sorrow, with our minds we can readily imagine, he believed, an ideal, perfect realm devoid of pain, illness, poverty, loss, sorrow, and whatever. And Adler contends that we are inevitably drawn to this world. We yearn for it. And to the best of our abilities, we seek to reach it through our efforts to restructure our lives and our society. That's why we are involved in social justice, to try to bring this world of injustice closer to a world of perfect justice. But because the realm, this ideal realm, is in fact ideal, by definition, we can never achieve it. Its reach always exceeds our grasp. Hence, caught between the actual realm and the ideal realm, the lot of man is one of frustration. Frustration is built again into the human experience, he believed. We are torn. We live in this world, but we are torn because we are pulled to the ideal which we can never have. Okay? But as a religious thinker, Adler in his ethical religion poses a way out, or proposes a way out. It is his solution, and he by no means requires that others, including members of the ethical society, need to buy into it. Indeed, it's a very hard sell. And here, Adler's thinking becomes esoteric. By the way, when I think of Adler as a religious thinker, you might think of that too. Whenever I see a portrait of Adler, we have this beautiful picture here, and the one upstairs, if you look at it symbolically, clearly that is deliberately painted to portray Adler as a religious figure. Look at it. You have his pate, okay, his bald forehead, which is glowing, right? And the rest of him sort of fades into the darkness. You have the contrast between light and dark, between enlightenment and ignorance. I mean, that clearly is part of the artistic, and I'm sure he wanted to be portrayed that way, which is, again, demonstrative, I think, of his religious thinking, which sort of shades into sort of what I'm going to be talking about. The way out of frustration Adler holds, and here we get a little bit, how should I say it? It'll challenge your understanding of ethical culture, let's put it that way. Okay, we're going to challenge your understanding and appreciation of ethical culture, and I don't want anybody heading for the doors. Okay, louder. Okay, the way out of frustration Adler holds is that we all possess a spiritual essence, and that we are all members of what he called the spiritual universe. Adler was a religious thinker, and he really did think that there was something beyond this world, this material world, a spiritual reality that was not personal. He did not believe in a personal God. There's nobody up there with a beard and so on who pulls strings. But he did believe that in this world of material things, there is a spiritual essence that indeed flows through it, and indeed all of us possess a type of spiritual essence, and we are all joined together to collectively in what he referred to as the ethical manifold, which is a weird term, better understood as what he referred to as the spiritual universe. We are all joined together in an organic whole, so that any action I take to influence others reciprocally creates a change in me. Hence, we are, to use his adage, to bring out the best in others, and thereby, reciprocally and by necessity, we will bring out the best in ourselves, because we're all together connected in this human family, this sort of web of spiritual beings. For Adler, there is something special, he maintains, furthermore, and distinctively inherent in the ethical act. There is something about acting ethically that he thought was a window into this spiritual reality. Through the ethical act, we gain an inkling of our spiritual transcendent nature, and we gain a glimpse, however fleeting, of the spiritual universe of which we are inseparably a part. Adler wrote, to quote, "My ideal of the divine life is that of a spiritual society infinite and composed of infinite members, infinitely diverse, each necessary to the whole, and the whole necessary to each. It is this ideal of the perfect life in which I seize the symbol of the utter reality of things, and the truth of this ideal I can discover in ethical experience, for this I interpret it as nothing else than the endeavor to act towards my fellow beings as a member of the infinite spiritual society would act towards his fellows, seeking to prompt and quicken them to express the eternal excellence that is potential in each, and thereby making actual the eternal excellence that is mine." Then, end quote. Then, building on this idea of the infinite spiritual society, Adler, in his last chapter of his magnum opus called An Ethical Philosophy of Life, and his last chapter is entitled The Last Outlook on Life, Adler discusses our confrontation with our own mortality. And he says the following, and I'll read that, but I want to make one thing. He took this very seriously. We have only one example, about 15 minutes long, of Adler's voice, okay? In the 1930s, he cut a record album, okay? And in that album, there's about a 15 or 20 minute citation, and he's reading from this last chapter of his book on the last outlook on life that deals with our confrontation with our death and our mortality, okay? He believed, Adler had a notion, very, very esoteric, probably would not provide consolation to anyone about a type of immortality, not personal, okay? A personal immortality he did not believe in, but something survives, he believed, the death of the body, and so on. Most ethical cultures today probably would not hold to that view. But the point I want to make is, and it's just an aside for what it's worth, that since he chose that selection for the only recording of his voice he ever made, he probably took it very seriously. You know? I mean, that's the inference that I that I draw from that. Anyway, from that he says, and his language here is almost Christian, okay? He says, the world as we know it is itself the veil, the screen that shuts out the interplay, the weavings and interweavings of the spiritual universe. But at least at one point in the ethical experience of man is the screen translucent. The plan of a spiritual relation is there traced in outline. It is the plan that conveys that certainty as to what verily exists beyond, within, beneath. The thought of this is apprehended, not in terms of knowledge, but in immediate experience, begets the peace that passeth understanding. And it is upon the bosom of that peace that we can pass safely out of the realm of time and space. Wow. In effect, he's saying that we can recognize through an act of intuition born of the ethical act that we have a spiritual nature and that we are all, as individual spiritual selves, part of this broader spiritual universe. And once we recognize that, it brings a type of peace, a type of equanimity that overcomes our fears of death and so on and so forth. Okay. Well, in short, okay, it is our recognition of our place in the spiritual universe that is a vehicle to get us beyond the frustration that we usually experience in the everyday world, as well as mitigate the fear of death. To get ourselves beyond the pain, sorrows, and frustrations that so riddle the human condition, Adler sees, along with many other students of the human condition, he sees this need as a widely felt and deep need of the human soul, so to speak. Well, certainly this is a far cry from what most of us would understand ethical culture to be. Okay. But my point is that this effort to frame some concept of an eternal spiritual universe and our immortal place in it certainly places Adler, again, among religious thinkers, and his attempt to use religious and philosophical ideas to get us beyond the pain and suffering and fear we experience, to leverage us beyond the contingencies of life, in a sense to work to enable us to discover a stable, unchanging place where we can find peace and security beyond the frustrations, tragedies, and hardships which go with our lived experiences. In short, as with so many religions, he tries to enable us to contemplate a different realm and land us somewhere in which what ails us in the lives we live remains behind, or at least will be transformed in a benevolent way in their meaning. The point is that there is a yearning. There's a yearning felt by much of humankind to escape the world, so to speak. Religion and philosophy are vehicles by which to do it, but they are not the only ones. In a much less lofty and more mundane sense, someone had once defined the human being as a psychopharmacological animal. Now, we are sometimes referred to as a tool-making animal, okay, or a rational animal. One anthropologist referred to us, and I forget who it was, as I should look it up, as a psychopharmacological animal. And what he observed is a very strange fact about human beings as a species, that since the beginning of time, people have tried to change their normal consciousness through the imbibing of various substances, namely drugs. Okay, be it alcohol, peyote, mescaline, marijuana, LSD, or whatever. It is as if we are dissatisfied with our normal consciousness and try to escape it by launching ourselves into new, strange, and heightened forms of consciousness. And this weird tendency can be used to define us as animal creatures. And I think it's true that no other animal behaves this way, at least not deliberately. But it is interesting that human beings have, that doesn't mean everybody drops acid, or smokes pot, but there is across the board a type of generic, right? If you look at human history from the beginning of time, there's this strange tendency of human beings to take drugs in order to change their normal consciousness into a different form of consciousness, and this in a way defines the type of creatures that we are. Interesting thought. But getting back to religion, perhaps the most extreme example of attempting to escape the hardships which accompany the human condition is found in what is referred to as mystical experience. Mysticism is a minor tradition, so to speak, in all the great religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and a multitude of others. They all have a mystical arm to them. Mystical thought and experience can also be found in secular contexts. And I must admit that it's a phenomenon which certainly captivates my own interest, though I would be hard-pressed to admit that I have personally ever had a full-blown mystical experience. But the idea has great appeal to me. Actually, once I did, and I'll tell you about it. It's not all that dramatic. A little bit later, maybe. Okay. Well, what is mysticism? Mysticism is a change of consciousness that seeks to enable us to escape time and situate ourselves in an eternal present where we are not bogged down by either thoughts of the past or anxieties about the future. In its most basic sense, it is a felt experience in which the boundaries that separate our individual selves from the wider reality which surrounds us, those boundaries fall away. Our everyday sense of ourselves is that each of us is an individual ego that is separate from the environment and the reality in which we move about. There is me and there is not me, and there is a boundary that separates me as a discrete individual from you and from all else, everything that is not me. Okay. The mystical experience occurs when the boundaries that separate ourselves from all else fall away, and we experience a sense of unity or unification with the broader reality of which we are a part. For those who are not traditionally religious, perhaps the most common form of mystical experience is derived from what we might call nature mysticism. That's just something I think everybody here, especially our environmentalists, can relate to. Okay. It's a font of environmental consciousness and concern. I'm walking through an august forest. Anybody here been to Sequoia National Park or the Muir Woods? Okay, you've probably come close to an experience. I mean, how you can't be moved by that, I don't know, right? Okay, if you are, there's something wrong. I'm walking through an august forest, and a sensation overcomes me that I am one with nature. I come to feel what I intellectually know, and that is I'm inextricably part of it, something grander than I am. Or perhaps I'm gazing up at the stars on a particularly clear and splendid night, something you can't do anymore with light pollution, and sense that I am one with the glorious and infinite universe. Carl Sagan once noted that we are all made, quote, of star stuff. Okay, that is what's in us, the elements that make us up, or once in the interior of stars. Okay, the stars in us are really the same basically atoms and elements that are just simply rearranged in different forms, right? We're all made of star stuff. The mystical experience puts us in immediate contact with that reality as a felt experience. There's a famous line in Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay entitled Nature, which captures the essence of the mystical moment. Now, Emerson was a New England transcendentalist, and these guys, and a few women too, it was the birth really of early feminism in America, in effect were always walking through the woods. I mean, they hung out in the Berkshires and the Adirondacks, and they were always looking to commune with nature. And in his beautiful essay, Emerson makes this observation. He says, standing, and he's always hyperbolic, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. Then he says, I become a transparent eyeball. Okay. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part and particle of God. Now, he doesn't mean by God, again, a personal God. He means a type of universal, impersonal spirit that permeates nature, all things, including us. I should mention that reference to I become a transparent eyeball was over the top even for his day. I mean, there were cartoons written, of these stick figures with transparent eyeballs and top hats walking, so the newspapers got a lot of laughs out of that. But you understand the point. We usually see the eye as an active agent of sight. What he's saying in the mystical moment, all reality, the eyeball becomes transparent, and in fact, rather than being an active agent, reality, we sense that broader reality passes through. Do you see what I'm saying? The eye becomes virtually passive in that regard, and reality passes through it. I become a transparent eyeball. But the point is here, the important point is the ego disappears. Its perceptive functioning becomes passive, and we sense that, again, all nature flows through us. we are one with it. The reference again to transparent eyeball is a little bit strange, but it makes the point. In a more modern idiom, nature mysticism was expressed in the poetry of Mary Oliver, a contemporary poet who is a nature poet, and one of her better known verses is as follows. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Again, the oneness of the person and nature. Some have compared Mary Oliver to the great 18th century British poet who had a very strong mystical bent, that is William Blake. Blake's pithiest and most famous expression of mystical consciousness was captured in the following quatrain. He wrote this series of poems called Auguries of Innocence, and this is very famous and very illustrative of the mystical moment. He says, it's only 4 lines, he says, to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Okay, that's beautiful. You can take a grain of sand and from that spin out from it and create the whole world that indeed created that grain of sand and on which it's dependent. Okay, interesting. And of course, eternity is made up of an endless number of hours, right? They all blend together, okay? What the mystical sensibility expresses is the yearning of those so inspired to escape this world, at least the world of change, of contingency, of pain, desire, nostalgia, sorrow, frustration, and suffering, which comprises so much of the human experience, and to seek refuge, as it were, in what is an eternal, unchanging now, an unchanging now. It means letting go of the past and our desires of the future and its anxieties, for only the present moment is truly real. To aspire to such a frame of mind, to dwell in the moment, we might say, is to seek and attain a stance of invulnerability from the slings and arrows of life. To escape this world is an act of invulnerabilism. That's my point, to become invulnerable to the world. As stated, one does not need to be a religious person to have such experiences, but mystical unification of the self and all-encompassing realities, a perception that all the great religions have developed to a high degree, although in each faith it remains a minor tradition, a minor branch. Although they have often been branded as heretics, for the Christian mystic, the ultimate unity is the unity of the individual soul with God, okay? But it is in the Eastern faiths where they've developed perhaps these types of transcendent experiences most elaborately, and they've become very central to many of the Eastern religions. While Hinduism is a religious culture with a bewildering variety of teachings and practices, perhaps the best form best known in the West is what is known as Vedantic Hinduism. In Vedanta, the only reality that exists is the Brahman, which is all that is. It is the great all, capital A, all of reality. Each of us possesses our individual selves, known as the Atman. But Atman and all that we perceive in the world is based on false knowledge, and according to Hinduism, does not truly exist. By coveting things in this world, by chasing our desires, we are clinging to illusions. As we travel through the world, we experience an almost endless cycle of deaths and rebirths. The object of Vedanta is to end this cycle and to achieve moksha, that is freedom or liberation from the endless chain of death and rebirth, at which point the Atman, or the individual self, will experience reality as it truly is, and the Atman will dissolve into the Brahman and be dissolved with it, be identified with it. This is a state of ultimate bliss and ultimate freedom. This unification of Atman and Brahman is often illustrated by the Sanskrit phrase tatsvamasi, which translates as thou art that. Thou art that. In other words, you and the infinite encompassing reality are one and the same and undifferentiated. The self becomes dissolved into the infinite reality of which it is a part, as particles of salt, when stirred in water, dissolve into it and become identified and inseparable. Well, Buddhism, which emerged as a Hindu heresy of sorts, perhaps presents the most emphatically elaborated system for getting us beyond the contingencies of this world. Although highly complex with multiple sects espousing different doctrines, classical Buddhism, which is more a psychological system than a religion, indeed there is no God in classical Buddhism, is based on what is known as the Four Noble Truths. Buddhism can also be a highly intellectual system that uses critical thinking to assess the human condition. The first truth of the Four Noble Truths is that life is pain and suffering. Life is equated with pain. Life is pain, okay? Like a doctor providing a diagnosis for pain, Buddhism concludes that the cause of suffering, which includes frustration, disappointment, all kinds of negative emotions, okay, is desire. The cause of pain is desire, or what Buddhism refers to as attachment, That's the second noble truth. The prescription to get beyond suffering and the like, which is the third noble truth, is to annihilate desire. Okay? Pain is our bedrock reality. It's caused by attachment or desire, and the prescription is to basically annihilate our desire in order to detach ourselves, okay, as it were. And the way to do that, which constitutes the fourth noble truth, is to live one's life according to the Eightfold Path, which requires, and I like the Eightfold Path, it's very ethical, which requires right views, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. I dare say Donald Trump is as far away from the Eightfold Path as we could possibly imagine. He really is the actual opposite of the embodiment of the Eightfold Path, I think. Hey, I couldn't resist that. Right, okay. Well, with a life so lived, one will eventually break the bonds of attachment to life and the cycles of death and rebirth, and ultimately achieve the state of nirvana, which actually means, in Sanskrit, emptiness, a state of emptiness. In Buddhist teaching, the idea of letting go of attachment is very thoroughgoing. In the deeper recesses of Buddhist thought, nothing truly exists in and of itself, in that everything is relative or dependent on something else for its existence. But for our interests, Buddhism also makes the claim that the idea we have of our own individual egos, our own selves, is a fiction, and that too is a form of attachment. We tend to imagine that we each possess a self, like a little homunculus in our heads, in which our personal identities are located. But at most, what we find, in effect, are neurological impulses. And what we sense as a self or an ego is an imaginary person we construct out of our surrounding experiences that impinge on us. So in Buddhism, an objective is to transcend or annihilate the concept of our individual self. Thinking we are an individual self or ego is the ultimate form of attachment. A central concept in Buddhism is emptiness. Emptiness, however, is not a synonym for nihilism. It is not that nothing exists. Rather, to perceive the world as empty is really, in Buddhism, a mode of changed consciousness, of perception. It is to understand that nothing exists independently by itself, but all things contain those elements which go into creating it. So if Buddhists claim that the self is empty, it is understand that there is no separate entity such as an independent self, that what I sense as myself is really a composite of the neurological, social elements and whatever out of which I construct a sense of the self. Once we grasp the reality of emptiness, it actually opens up to a fuller appreciation of reality, and that each individual carries within himself and herself the entire universe. When it comes to our emotions, this change in perception can be most useful. If I become very angry and remain attached to my anger and believe that it's mine and mine alone, then it can fester and cause great pain and be self-destructive. But if I can change perspective and see that what I originally sense as my anger has origins and causes far greater than me and outside of me, then I can step back, gain some distance from it, and perhaps achieve a calmer, less engaged relation to my anger. I can become, in other words, an observer of my anger rather than a person who suffers from it. I want to get back to this observation in just a moment when I close with my thoughts on humanism. In its teaching, Buddhism presents among the most sophisticated, detailed, and philosophically elegant system to enable people to get beyond or escape the everyday condition and experiences we endure in our ordinary existence. My point in this long survey is that if we look at the career of humankind, there has been an unmistakable and persistent yearning to get beyond the everyday human condition, and much of religion and philosophy has been devoted to this task. There is a yearning to get beyond the contingencies of life and find a place of perfect peace, so to speak. And so my final question is, where does humanism stand in this quest to escape the world? Our answer needs to depend on how we define humanism. I think that we can define humanism as a philosophy of life and an orientation that puts a premium on human flourishing, and living the good life for ourselves and for all. That means, among other things, developing our human potentials, our emotions, our intellect, our physical abilities, our capacity for love, companionship, compassion, and caring, our sexual potentials, our appreciation for wisdom, art, and learning, our kindness, and caring again to the fullest extent possible. Humanism involves living a rich life and helping to bring out the conditions wherein all people can fulfill their potentials as well. Ethical culture adds to this an emphasis on respecting the dignity and the worth of all people, and this respect is certainly a requirement for the achievement of good life. If we are humanists so understood, then it seems that we need to stand apart, I would argue, from the invulnerablest position, at least in its purest form. If we seek to rise above the contingencies of life and make ourselves invulnerable to suffering and misfortune, then we need to let go of desire and remove ourselves from caring and love and striving for better things. If humanism isn't committed to embracing the fullness of the human experience, then it must be prepared to endure sorrow and loss together with happiness, joy, and achievement. Most humanists want to be gripped by what we do and those we care about, and I don't think we want to escape it if escaping means giving up love, caring, aspiration, and the struggle for a better life. But the story doesn't need to end there, I believe. If we look at the religious philosophies I've cited, it is my conclusion that the devout Hindu or Buddhist doesn't truly live his or her life in the way their religious philosophies promote in their classical or ideal forms. And Felix Adler certainly didn't believe that we could ever launch ourselves completely beyond the world of frustration. The Buddhist, Hindu, or whoever is not devoid of compassion or neglectful of the things of this world. The Dalai Lama, for example, is by no means uninvolved or uninvested in the politics of Tibet, even though he seeks nirvana and, in effect, escape, so to speak, from the world. But what such philosophies do, in a functional sense, is to change one's perspective on the harshness of life. And I think that humanism can learn something from this. What I mean is that within the humanist worldview, it is perfectly appropriate to adopt perspectives which take the edge of our harshness and suffering. As humanists, we don't need to seek invulnerability from life's hardships, but we can lessen them. We can lessen them by often recognizing that there is much in life that we cannot control, and seeking to master it. What we cannot control is an illusion. Life is full of contingencies. Bad things happen to us, but so do very good things. Things come and go, and sometimes we can take the edge off of bad things that happen to us by recognizing that fact. When bad things happen to us, we lose a job or fall out of a love relationship, we are not saying that our suffering should be drained from them, but perhaps we can lessen the suffering if we step back and look at these misfortunes across a broader landscape of events and place them in the context of larger realities that played a role in their occurring. We don't need to be passive victims of life, nor do we need to escape it. We don't have to be perfect Buddhists to utterly remove ourselves from these events and the emotions they generate. But we can at least strive to step back and look at the larger picture while recognizing that we only have limited control over our lives. We can adopt the stance of what sometimes is referred to in psychology as the observing ego. We can step back from our own behaviors and what happens to us by observing it, almost as if it were happening to someone else. Okay, I personally have tried several ways, and we can train ourselves to become observing egos to what we endure in life. I myself have tried to do this, and in one way I've won some partial success, I might say, and I want to share this with you. And it's an experience that everyone here has had, I'm sure, especially if you drive. And in effect, it's very mundane and sounds very trivial. But if you can do this in other avenues of life, it's not bad, okay? I used to simply be beside myself and tear my hair out when I would get stuck in front of a Holland tunnel for an hour, knowing that I had an appointment to keep in Manhattan and I was going to miss the appointment. I mean, I would just go nuts behind the wheel. Do you know what I'm saying? With anger, frustration, and misery, and so on. And I said, look, I don't like this. It's painful, right, to get upset with oneself. And over a period of time, I was able to train myself, to convince myself, hey, you know, there's nothing I can do about this, right? And being upset about it is totally futile, totally self-destructive, a waste of time. Whatever happens will happen, and that's it. And you know what? The sun will rise again tomorrow, right? It's not awful. And you know what? Through that reflective, meditative exercise, I've gotten much better, okay? I don't get upset now when I get stuck in traffic at the George Washington Bridge or the Lincoln Tunnel or the Holland Tunnel and so on and so forth, because it's become clear. I've been able to distance myself from my own emotions and observe them rather than be a victim of them. People understand the experience? Okay, right, okay, right. Because I recognize that being stuck in front of the tunnel has causes much larger than me, and there's nothing I can do about it, and therefore I can gain a certain sense of calm. It was what Friedrich Engels once referred to, a beautiful insight. He said, freedom is the knowledge of necessity. Freedom is the knowledge of necessity. A beautiful phrase, good thing to remember. Well, let me close by saying, in short, as humanists, I would say life comes with the recognition that it includes both scars as well as joys. And I suspect that most of us, most of the time, would not want it any other way. That's it.